Moira Bergin, welcome. You're joining us as Subcommittee Director for Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation for the House Committee on Homeland Security. Your background includes not only congressional staff service, advising members in this arena, but also wider work in state judiciary. What do you see as the core drivers of our vulnerability to cyber attacks?
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I think in terms of what are the drivers behind our vulnerabilities to cyber attacks, I think the principal driver is for too long, we've been very comfortable to hit the snooze button on cybersecurity, whether it's because we didn't understand it, we were intimidated by it, we didn't want to get into the fights with our political allies about what would be expected of us to do more, whether that's interagency turf fighting or between the government and the private sector. There's been a reluctance to engage in difficult conversations about what needs to happen to make us safer. And there's also been a reluctance to invest the money that we need to put into the problem.
In general, then, a lack of urgency up to this point?
I think there are a few drivers to the lack of urgency. I think, first of all, we've talked about cyber threats in sort of the abstract, and the impacts and consequences of them haven't really hit people directly. There hasn't been a loss of life in the United States. There hasn't been really physical injury. So without that, without the public feeling it, there's not a lot of motivation for policymakers to ask more of the private sector in a way that jeopardizes their pre-existing relationships with the private sector. I think there's also an intimidation factor where members of Congress are still getting up to speed on what cybersecurity means and what kinds of policies need to be put into place to to yield more security benefits.
Have recent events changed any of that?
I think we're at a turning point now, following SolarWinds, and more importantly, Colonial. I think Colonial members understood that people couldn't get gas.
So there are tangible consequences to attacks now.
I think as we're starting to see those more real consequences, that's going to drive action, and that's going to give people the political cover to take bold, more ambitious action that, even 2 years ago would have been unthinkable.
What type of actions, for example?
This year, people are chomping at the bit to introduce mandatory cyber incident reporting legislation. So I think we are really seeing a sea change, and I think more people are coming to the table to do bold, ambitious things in order to make critical infrastructure more secure.
Is the private sector perspective changing on this, at least in part?
A year ago, 2 years ago, when we were trying to do the same thing, the private sector would come in, not so much with the goal of working with us to perfect our legislation or perfect text, but to kill it. They didn't want any additional regulation. They didn't want the government telling them what to do. Today, we had people testify at hearings. We had, I think, Kevin Mandiant testify at our hearing, we must have mandatory cyber incident reporting. We had the CEO of SolarWinds saying we have to have mandatory cyber incident reporting. This is a real sea change. You don't usually have the private sector coming and saying we need cyber incident reporting. That's hardly a silver bullet, and I think we need to get away from silver bullet solutions, but it certainly is like an arrow in our quiver.
Is there the wherewithal and capacity for the federal government to ingest and take action on cyber reporting and other initiatives?
I think we are at a real tipping point, and we're also, I would be remiss if I did not mention, at a turning point in investment. For a long time, CISA, or formerly NPPD, was relatively, I don't want to say it was flat funded, but it got very, very modest increases every year for its federal network security programs and even for its critical infrastructure security programs. We're now seeing a real acknowledgement by both the administration and Congress that this problem is going to take investment to solve.
So then what are the actionable strategies to take on this challenge?
I think the government needs to lead by example. So to the extent that we're able to resource the government to develop its own networks and set an example that way, and then invest in government capabilities to better partner with the private sector by providing better intelligence, by providing better tactical support to different sectors. So that means, not just engaging with the well-resourced, more mature sectors like energy, telecom, and financial services, but also tailoring support to water and to HHS or to healthcare. That will really raise the bar in cybersecurity.
What do you mean by better tactical support?
We need to have better analytic capabilities that we can turn around and take the data that the government collects, hopefully through new authorities like incident reporting and perhaps through a cybersecurity type program, and really crunch that data. And the data it collects from its own federal network security programs, crunch that data and turn it around to provide something that's actually actionable to the private sector partners. I think that's the first thing, leading by example. And then secondly, to help lead by example, we need to invest in the capacity at our federal agencies that have cybersecurity responsibilities. So that means investing at CISA. That's like our hub. That's our powerhouse. That's where the real analytics happen, where the data comes together and they spin it and they crunch it and they hopefully provide products to people that provide good situational awareness, risk mitigation tactics, and defensive measures that people can implement. We have to invest in sector risk management agencies. So CISA doesn't do this work on its own. It relies on its partners at Department of Energy, Department of Treasury, HHS, EPA, to be able to take the products that CISA turns out, the intelligence that it's pushing out, and tailor it for its particular sector to make sure that what CISA is putting out is actionable for water, for energy, for treasury. And we need to make sure that the sector risk management agencies are resourced to do it. That means having the money to carry out the work, and most importantly, having the people. I can't stress enough the importance of people in this process. We can have all the tools that we want, but if we don't have the people who can use those tools, they're not of much use to us. So really investing in making sure we have the right people to do the work that needs to be done for the federal level, and to both to defend its own networks and to effectively partner with the private sector. We need to find innovative ways to build cybersecurity capacity in the private sector. That means working on building the talent pool available not just to the government, but to the private sector, and getting people interested in cybersecurity, making it an approachable field of study for somebody who might otherwise be intimidated by it.
That could be especially important in this economy.
I think it's about making cybersecurity approachable as a career path. I also think for the workforce, it means cross-training. So I think, I think right now we think of cybersecurity as sort of a siloed field of study where, I'm going to take cybersecurity classes because I do cybersecurity. But I think there needs to be more of an effort to weave cyber through different areas of study. So whether that is in vocational programs, also weaving through cybersecurity, so that folks who are dealing with mechanics or other people doing vocational skills understand the nexus between cybersecurity and whatever it is that they're doing, particularly as everything we do becomes more networked. I think that will be really an important thing to do moving forward. I also think we need to think about reskilling and opportunities to reskill workforce who's perhaps they are unhappy with their jobs, or their jobs are becoming, I don't want to say obsolete, but there's a less demand for their job as perhaps things become more automated.
You recommend making cybersecurity more approachable as a career path. In a wider sense, does cybersecurity need to be made more approachable, more understood in general by our society?
I think we need to make it less intimidating of a topic so that everybody is comfortable playing their part. That means, the ordinary citizen at their computer not clicking on the phishing link and understanding why. And then the C-suite folks understanding why investment needs to be made and how in the long run it will save them money and be better for business and national security.
What about cyber metrics for organizations?
We've done a good job pushing out some standards for IT networks. but even if you look at the NIST framework, it's hard to know. Like, people will say, "Oh, I've implemented the NIST framework," but it's hard to know if they really have, because it's something that's hard to audit, and we don't require audits. So I think that we'll have to have some objective measure available, not necessarily mandated at this point, but some objective measure available to help the private sector understand if they've actually implemented the guidance correctly.
You reference IT networks, and they are certainly vital to all of our organizations. But in critical infrastructure, operational technology, OT, can play a critical role as well.
I think we've spent a lot of effort focusing on IT security, and I think that's important. But I think we also need to start thinking more about OT, which is, I think, a more complicated problem, because ICS systems tend to be more bespoke and perhaps harder to provide generalized guidance for. But I think we really need to figure out what we can do, what the demand is in the private sector, and help deliver what they need from us.
Most of this will take substantial investment, not only by government, but also the private sector. What about incentives for cybersecurity?
We're going to have to start thinking about more creative, outside the box solutions to cybersecurity, and getting and incentives for the private sector to invest in cybersecurity. And I think we're going to have to take approach of nothing's off the table till it's off the table. So, is there a point at which we start to consider different types of tax benefits for folks who make good auditable investments in cybersecurity?
We've talked in large part about preparedness and response. What can government do about deterrence, not only for criminals, but also when some of these attacks are coming from nation states or state-sanctioned entities?
That's a very complicated issue. I don't think anyone's terribly interested in getting into a cyber tit for tat, but we do need to figure out also how we deter behavior. I think part of that is raising the cost of that behavior, so making it harder to get into private sector networks and get into critical infrastructure. But at some point, there's going to have to be consequences. I'm encouraged by the administration's more multilateral approach and in working with our allies to start setting up cyber norms. But I think there's going to have to be a consequence side too, if we're really going to talk about defending private sector networks.
So, in closing, do you think that the environment is ripe for greater collaborative action against cyber threats?
We have got a government that's very interested in making progress on this topic. The administration is replete with cyber experts that have a bias towards action, and I think that's excellent. I think Congress is losing patience with the types of attacks we're seeing, and is willing to make policy and make investments to drive down the risk. And I think we're seeing even the private sector coming in more willing to be a partner